Sacred Warrior. All righty, excellent. Okay. Back to work. Good to see everybody. Excuse me. Been under the weather for the past week, but I still made it here, right? Aren't you happy? Yes, we are, Dr. Our guardian angel is happy, Mr. All righty, back to work, as I said. All right, talking about the church, talking about church structures today. I hope you took a look at 1st and 2nd Timothy and at the letter to Titus. They were in your readings. At least I think 1st Timothy was, but certainly Titus. Hopefully, Titus is not a very long letter. Oh, wait, this is world religions. Sorry. Okay. Here we go. Early church structures. Okay, so how is the church structured? And you should also already know this, actually, this information more fully from having read the catechism. Right, Mr. Bellamy? Right? Because, of course, you know, Ms. Wamelsdorf, there will be questions on the quiz. We have a quiz this week. And just the other day, I was writing up questions, you know. A lot of them taken from the catechism. Well, read the catechism, take a look at it. But, you know, basically, the church is structured. It's the people of God, okay? All remember the basic definition is those who believe in Jesus and have been baptized, okay? So that includes, I would assume, Pope Francis. I hope. You know? Anyways. Although in the history of the church, there have been people who were not baptized yet who were actually elected pope, and then they had to be quickly baptized and ordained deacons, priests, and bishops, and then so they could be pope. But anyways, that's the exception that proves the rule. It's anomalous. But from the Pope Francis, who I'm assuming has been baptized and believes in Jesus, down to me, just, you know, I'm not a priest, I'm not a bishop like the Pope or whatever. Okay, so the most basic structure here would be, I guess you could say, and then maybe three, would be the people, all the people of God, the assembly, but usually called the laity. It comes from the Greek word laos. We encountered this word maybe way back when, you remember, when we talked about liturgy. Laos and ergon, a public work. Liturgy is the church's public worship. Laos simply means the people or people. So the people of God, the laos, is the laos to Greek, if you want to put it that way. So the laity. But out of the laity, okay, so that's our most basic structure. You have the believers who are living the faith and passing the faith on. But then out of the believers, you have a more clear government, I guess you could say government or structure, which we can call the hierarchy, which not all people are part of. These are the actual leaders, and you could say rulers in the community. Arche in Greek means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is rule. Okay, so a monarchy is ruled by one. Hierarchy is ruled by sacred figures. Hieros means sacred or holy. Okay, so those who are involved in holy things related to the gods, hierarchy. Okay. You know, on like CNN, and the big word of the week on CNN is oligarchy now. Ruled by the few. All those bosses, few and dreamy. So ruled by the few, which they really mean is one. And you think you know who they're talking about. Guy with all those cars. That's politics. That's not religion. So let's move on. And then three, out of the laity, we can add a third actually, and you probably know this from the catechism, but out of the people who are not part of the hierarchy, but also people who are part of the sacred ruler, sacred leadership, you could say, the hierarchy. Then we have people who are, this can be confusing, we call them religious, but you know, they're called consecrated, those in consecrated life.
those who have consecrated their lives more deeply to the following of God, to a life of prayer. And you find people like that out of the laity who are not part of the hierarchy, but also some members of the hierarchy. So, for example, we have the Sisters of Mercy. We founded this university, and one of the sisters is teaching in the other classroom. So she's, there are different levels of consecration as well. I'm not getting too much inside baseball. Let's stay away from that. But nevertheless, she's consecrated as a sister. She's devoted her life. She's unmarried. She gives up marriage. These people usually give up marriage. Not always, but in a lot of religious groups, they give up marriage. They live together. They have set times of prayer during the day. That's what their focus is. They're seeking God. So they're called religious or consecrated. And they can be just, as I said, regular people. But you can also have priests who are members, even bishops who are members of certain religious groups. Like, for example, Pope Francis. Does anyone know what he's a member of? Which group, society? He is a religious, actually. He's part of the hierarchy. He's a bishop. But he's not a layperson anymore. Made into part of the hierarchy. Does anyone know what group he's part of? He joined a religious order. Anyone know? No? Kind of hinted at it when I said society. No? The Society of Jesus. Yes, it's called the Society of Jesus. What is its common name? How is it common? The Society of Jesus. How's it common? In the back. Oh, Mr. Mexicantino. Sorry. Mr. Mexicantino, do you know the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as? No? The Jesuits. Jesuits. You ever heard of the Jesuits? Maybe? No? Never? Not surprised. Okay. But the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, and he's actually a member of a religious community. So they're not really I don't want to put them, they're a distinct part of the church. But basically the church are the people of God, and out of the people of God, you have certain people who are chosen for leadership positions. There's nothing weird about this because I've shown you this already with Jesus. Jesus had disciples, Ms. Patton, and out of his disciples, Jesus chose those whom he wanted, and he called them apostles. So he created his own hierarchy within the people following him. Okay, so this is not unusual, really. It's just different because what Jesus starts develops, because you have Jesus and the 12, and then his followers. But after Jesus is gone and the apostles die, they're gone too. Presumably it was the will of Jesus that his community would continue beyond the apostles. And so successors are appointed. We've gone over this already. And the structure develops into three levels. The highest level is the overseer. I'll get to this other stuff. But the highest level is the overseer, also known as a bishop. Bishop, as it comes into the English language. The next level, the second level or order, is the elder, also known as a presbyter or a priest. Priest comes from the word presbyter. They're not exactly the same thing. They don't exactly have the same meaning, even though priest does come from presbyter into English. And then finally, we could say the lowest level, but that's just a figure of speech. It's not, it's still a level. The servant or the deacon, okay? And these are the specialized ministries, okay? These are ministries, specific ministries that develop within the Christian community. We know what a ministry is. It's service, yes? So that's why I, wanted to say that, it's the lowest level, but, in a manner of speaking, right, Ms. Barris? Because Jesus was a servant, okay? He's the servant of servants. He's the example of service. So, these are all servant positions, okay? Okay, back to my notes. We have descriptions of the development of these ministries. Now, in the ministry of Jesus, Jesus doesn't talk about bishops.
Jesus doesn't talk about presbyters. There's nothing about deacons in the Gospels, which would make sense because Jesus was there. Okay. You had the 12 there. All right. You start to see the development, for example, in Luke's, part 2 of his gospel, Luke 2.0, and Acts of the Apostles. Okay, after Jesus, and even during the time of the apostles, some of these ministries, like the deacons, start to emerge, and also presbyter, assistants to the apostles. So they emerge very quickly. And we have descriptions of them in the first and second letters of Paul to Timothy and the letter of Paul to Titus, these letters were written, you have that on the PowerPoint, anytime between the 60s when Paul was alive, or if you believe it was written by somebody else in the name of Paul, then it could be as late as the early 100s, like 110. Okay, so somewhere between 60 and 110. As I've told you before, I don't have a problem believing it's from St. Paul. And I've told you the arguments of why. But there it is. So my assumption will be that Paul wrote this, but nevertheless, it's still accepted as canonical scripture by the church. And in these letters, Paul describes these specialized ministries to which, as far as we know, only men were appointed. So that is continued. Jesus appoints only men as his apostles, 12, even though he does have women followers, but this male-only leadership continues on, as far as we know. Why? I don't know. You could say, well, why did Jesus do it? Well, you could say it's the will of Jesus. But, you could also say it's the culture as well. It's a very male-centric culture at the time. Probably didn't enter into people's minds, certainly not men's minds, I would think, Ms. Frege, that women could do this sort of thing. Although that's, you did have priestesses and prophetesses in the pagan religions. So it's not completely true that women, they might not have known about women being involved in religious affairs. Certainly in Judaism, women were involved in the home in religious affairs, but not in temple worship. The Jewish priesthood was reserved to men. So maybe they saw it as the will of God and just that was it. They didn't question it. I don't know. But in modern times, so it wasn't a question for Jesus. But now it's a question in modern times when you have a more egalitarian society, the equality of the sexes. And so now people ask this question about why should women be excluded, I guess you could say, from these ministries? What are the reasons? Well, okay. It's a question. Nevertheless, Paul describes these ministries as reserved also to males. All right? Bishop, elder, and servant, he mentions. The word, I'm giving you the literal translation instead of using, I would use them both simultaneously because they mean the same thing. They're the same thing. It's not like I'm denying church teaching by saying overseer rather than bishop. That's what it means. Episkopos, epi means over something. Skopos means to see or to look. Like a telescope, or a periscope, or a microscope. To see. So an overseer, one who oversees things. Elder, presbyter in Greek, means an older man, an elder, an older person who lived a lot of years, or a significant number of years. And diakonos in Greek, diakoneo in Greek, the verb means to serve. So literally a servant. So, And then later, more specialized terminology, which means the same thing. Bishop derives from the Greek word episkopos into English. Presbyter, we still just use presbyter, but also priest. And deacon, same thing. So these 3 levels of ministry are shown. And you might want to take out, dare I say it, you could take out your Bible and turn to the letter of Titus if you wanted to. It's April is coming, right? It's April. Oh, that Bible thing is still hanging around? Yeah. Where did I put it?
That's right. It's next to my earbuds. Okay. Oh no, wait. My earbuds are in my shoes. Right. Of course, it'd be class if she was listening to Dr. Dunn, but it's all. uh, so Sean. We're not going to read the whole letter, but I just want to start with Titus. I'm assuming you've read it, but especially verses 5 through 16. If anyone has Titus and would like to just read those verses 5 through 16, I'd appreciate it. Yes, go ahead, Ms. Wester. Yes. Thank you, Miss.
For this reason, I left you in Crete, so that you might set right what remains to be done and appoint ministers in every town, as I directed you. On condition that a man be blameless, married only once, with leaving children who are not accused of licentiousness or rebellious.
Licentiousness
Bishop as
means like sleeping around. People who like sleep around and stuff like that. Hook up.
For a bishop as God's steward must be blameless, not arrogant, not irritable, not a drunkard, not aggressive, not greedy for sordid gain, but hospitable, a lover of goodness, temperate, just, holy, and self-controlled, holding fast to the true message as taught, so that he will be able both to exhort with sound doctrine and to refute opponents. For there are also many rebels, idle talkers, and deceivers, especially the Jewish Christians. It is imperative to silence them, as they are upsetting whole families by teaching for sordid gain what they should not. One of them, a prophet of their own, once said, "Cretans have always been liars, vicious beasts, and lazy bosoms." That testimony is true. Therefore, admonish them sharply, so that they may be sound in the faith.
That's okay. We can stop there. Let's stop at verse 13. That's fine. Because he just goes on about his disagreements with these Jewish Christians, or the Jews. We're assuming they're Christians who are of Jewish descent. And they still, what he's referring to there is, there were early on, there were Jewish Christians who thought that you need to become a Jew before you could be a believer in Jesus. And so they wanted to continue on the Jewish practices and the following of the Jewish law. Kind of makes sense, because didn't we read from Acts of the Apostles that the apostles were still going to the temple and saying their prayers, and they were Jews, right? They were practicing as Jews. I mean, Jesus was circumcised. Jesus was a practicing Jew. Paul was still going to the synagogues on the Sabbath, so he was a practicing Jew. He was a rabbi, apparently. But I think the problem, so you might say, well, what's the problem then? But I think the problem was that they were saying in order to be saved, you had to be Jewish. You had to enter into Judaism in order to believe then in Jesus. And that's where Paul was kind of like drawing the line. It's like, no, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish law. If you want to keep the law, then keep the law, the Jewish law. But that's not what saves you. It was Jesus. So it's Jesus who saves you. He is the Savior. Okay? So there was a big kerfuffle and a big argument about that. And a lot of the New Testament, if you read it, is devoted to that whole problem, which is not really an issue now for a lot of Christians. Hasn't been an issue for a long time. But it was for Paul. So he's mentioning it. These were opponents, because they thought Paul was wrong. So you had Christians who were saying, no, Paul is wrong. He's teaching the wrong thing. He's teaching these non-Jews, these Gentiles, that they don't have to be circumcised and they can still believe in Jesus. They don't have to follow the food rules, the kosher laws, and they can still follow Jesus. And there were Jewish Christians who were like, No, no, no. You have to do these things as well, you know. So you see that, you know, there were problems, there were disagreements. Everyone was on board with this guy, Paul. Anyways, so he sends this man Titus. Who knows who Titus is? You know, I don't know. But Saint Titus, God bless him, who is an associate of Paul somewhere. And Paul sends him to the island of Crete, which you can see here in the Mediterranean Sea, Greece. And then down south of Greece is this big island called Crete, which is part of the country of Greece, although there is a Cretan independence movement, so who knows how long it will still be part of Greece. But it is now. And so Paul specifically sends this man Titus to Crete to do what? What does he say? For this reason, that you might set right what remains to be done. Okay, so apparently the church or the Christian community has already in some way been established there. I guess there are believers there already, but there are more things to do. And the first thing on the list is to appoint elders in every town, okay? Set up the hierarchy. Okay, you've got the laity. I just erased that, right, Ms. Cohen? But you remember. You've got the people of God there, who believers in Jesus, the laity, but we need hierarchy, okay? We need leaders, sacred leadership. So start appointing elders. Why not overseers, Mr. Womer? Why doesn't he mention overseers? Aren't they first? Aren't they at the top of the list? Don't you want to appoint the overseers first? And let the overseers then decide, okay, I'll make you an elder and you a deacon.
Would
Huh?
probably.
Yeah, I'm assuming, yeah. What do you think? What do you think? Huh? Okay, so Paul is not making sense then, right? You suppose. You're a good man, Mr. Wilmer. When I'm burning in purgatory, you'll be up in hell. Or you'll be up in heaven, I should say. I'm still here for 50,000 more years. Mr. Wilmer will be up there. Well, you should have answered correctly on the letter to Titus. You couldn't have said Paul was unsensible. Okay. Does he mention bishops, though? Does he mention overseers? What do you think, Ms. Crystal? Does Paul mention in the reading that Mr. Westergom gave us, does he mention overseers, or does he just say presbyters?
Sure.
You're not sure? Oh, okay, back to Mr. Womer. Go ahead.
You mentioned bishops being God's steward.
Ah, good, sir. You noticed that. Yes, verse 7. Yes, so he does. After he mentions elders. So that's kind of like reverse. It's like first appoint elders. That's number one, apparently. And then he starts talking about overseers. Okay. So what does he say about elders? He gives some conditions about what an elder should be, or a presbyter, that it should be a man. The man should be blameless, married only once. Ooh, Miss Donnelly. Ooh. Married only once. That his children should be believers. And anyone, I don't know if any of you are the children of pastors or ministers. But, you know, if you ever no Protestant ministers, oh, their children. Oh, yeah, that's the pastor's son. Yeah, causing trouble. Making me look bad. Anyway, so yeah, we got to make sure the children are on board with all of this and living the life. Not accused of licentiousness, which, you know, just means, as I said, sleeping around, hooking up. Could mean sexual things, but it could also mean carousing, you know, doing things you're not supposed to do, getting drunk, which he mentions as well. Rebellious, well, mentions in regards to bishops. Being rebellious, okay. Doing your own thing, I guess you could put it that way. And then he mentions the overseer. And he gives a little theological, I guess you could say, definition. of what the overseer is. Okay, which do I want to come back to? Yeah, I'll come back to that. But before I come to that, I want to point out the fact that we have what scholars call here this situation called a presbyter bishop. Whoops. Let's go to Titus. There we go. Presbyter bishop. In the early stages of the church, this distinction between scholars kind of recognize that this distinction between a presbyter, an elder, and a bishop maybe hadn't emerged so clearly as of yet. The two terms seem to be used synonymously sometimes, like here in Paul. He seems to be assuming that a bishop is a presbyter and a presbyter is a bishop. They're kind of the same, all right? Because he just goes on about a bishop. He says, first appoint presbyters and give some conditions. And then he says, for a bishop is God's steward. Okay, so now he's introducing something new, or is he still talking about a presbyter and just calling it by a different name? All right. So it's a scholarly term to describe this early stage where the functions and role of the overseer and the priest are not so clearly distinguished. They seem to be one and the same thing. So what is the role of a presbyter bishop? Eventually, they will become distinguished, and it will be seen that the bishop or the overseer is the head of ministry, okay? And so it's the bishop who will be seen as the person who has truly succeeded to the ministry of the apostles, and is also the president, the presider, the CEO, you could say, the chief executive officer of the church in a certain area. And then the elders or the presbyters are his assistants. They share in some of his authority that he delegates to them. They're like delegates of the bishop. And then the deacons are something else, so we don't need to worry about that. They have appointments. Well, maybe I'll come to that later. Wait. So he gives us a nice little definition of what a presbyter bishop should be. A steward, well, what's a steward? Well, I'm not sure. Let's look it up. Anyone want to look it up on Merriam-Webster Dictionary and give you an extra credit point? The word steward, If you want an extra credit point, the definition of a steward. Basically, a steward is someone who keeps things for someone else, like banks are stewards of your money. They're holding on to your money for you and distributing it to you when you want it or need it. No one's going to look it up for me? Not even for an extra credit point. Oh, Ms. Barris, go ahead. Ooh, yes. A householder who manages the needs of the house. I guess that's why I put this. Oh, there it is. I guess that's why I put it on my PowerPoint, right, Ms. Barris? Is there a second definition for that? Okay, well, I'm going to assume, Ms. Womelsdorf, that that's not what Paul means. Because they didn't have planes, they didn't have trains back then. They did have ships, and ships do have stewards as well. Basically, people who take care of stuff for you. They take care of stuff, Like your mom and your dad are kind of like your stewards. They're stewards of the household. That's what my brother always tells me. I just call up my brother and say, oh, can you do this for me? Can you do that? I got to run a household. I'm busy. I'm running a household. And oikonomos from the word oikos in Greek, which means house, economy. It's literally what economy means. It's, the basic running of a household. The most basic economy is a household. You got to pay your bills, right? You got to manage the money you got to bring money in some way, okay? You also have to manage the money that's going out to bills or to what you're spending it on. You don't want to overspend, okay? Because then you don't have enough, you're in debt. We call that debt. You have to do capital investments, like, fix the place up. If the Plumbing's broke, you got to fix the plumbing. The roof is broke, you got to fix the roof. You got to buy food for the family so you can eat, you know. So it's running, it's a job. It is a job. Housewives are working. They're not doing nothing. Or not even housemen, if they're housemen, but you know what I'm saying. You got to run the house. You're a house manager. And that's kind of how he describes what the bishop is. The bishop is the steward, the house manager of God's things, what pertains to the things of God. Okay? So spiritualities, the supernatural. And he gives conditions again. The bishop, overseer must be blameless, not arrogant, not irritable, not a drunk. That comes up a lot. I guess drinking was a big problem back then, but don't get a drunken, not a drunk. Not mean or aggressive, not greedy for money. But he should be hospitable, he should be welcoming to people, a lover of goodness, temperate, meaning he doesn't fly off the handle at the drop of a hat. He also doesn't start crying his eyes out, But it's so beautiful. There's nothing like the love between a woman and a ghost. Nothing can equal it. Anyways. All right, pull it together, Bishop. Pull it together. Anyways, just and holy. One would hope that he's holy, that he's good, he's concerned about the things of God and self-control. But then we get to verse 9, holding fast to the true message as taught. Holding fast to the true message as taught. Sacred tradition. What has been handed on to him, he faithfully passes it on to others. And then Paul delves into this group he's disagreeing with, which is on his mind, which are these Jewish Christians, which is kind of like Paul's hobby horse. But he's kind of telling maybe that was a problem in the Cretan church, in the church on the island of Crete. They had Jewish Christians amongst them. But you have to teach the true message, not what the overseer might want to teach, but what he has been given to teach. So it's not about him. And anyone who's been around bishops, like when I was in the seminary, you're around bishops a lot. Yeah, they think it's about them. We got into trouble one time because we had a bishop there. Who was he? I think it was the nuncio for the Pope. Yeah, it was the papal nuncio to the United States, the papal ambassador of the United States, came to the seminary to give a little talk. They slipped him a little bit of money on the side. It's like, anyways. And I remember, the guy made, he was a nice guy. He made some kind of off-color remark about one of the Polish seminarians, about his name, made a little joke about his name, which I guess you wouldn't get away with today. You'd be, tarred and feathered. But back then, even then, it was a little bit like, oh, be careful, Bishop, And so everyone laughed. I didn't laugh. I said, don't worry, Bishop. I think the rector was there, and he said, "Oh, Bishop, you're so bad." And I said something like, "Nah, that's okay, Bishop. Even if you were wrong, I wouldn't tell you because you're a bishop. Don't want to get it." And the rector was like, "Matthew, don't say that stuff out loud." Maybe explains why I didn't stick in the seminary for very long. But it was true. It was true. Anyways. So the bishops. What's lacking from Paul's letter? He doesn't mention deacons or any qualifications for deacons. That doesn't mean, I don't think it means that Paul didn't believe in deacons or he was denying the order of deacons. It's just he doesn't mention deacons at all as being part of the church structure. He's more concerned with the basic structure of the presbyter bishop, the most basic structure. Okay, and then I guess the other things could take care of themselves, right? At least that's my belief. I guess I'll talk about this orthodoxy and heresy, but maybe I'll come back. Well, no, okay, I'll come back. I might come back to it later. We go to First Timothy. All right, the first letter of Timothy, in two places in Timothy, chapters 3 and chapter 5, we have the full structure mentioned. He mentions overseers, he mentions presbyters, and he does mention deacons. Okay, this is Paul's letter to this young man, apparently, named Timothy, who was a Jew, at least his mother was Jewish, who was being appointed as an overseer of some community. Who knows? Paul doesn't say where, but Paul writes him two letters to kind of give him advice about what he needs to do as a good overseer. And some of the same concerns are evident in these letters as in Titus, okay? We don't have to read the whole thing. I'll just pick through it and talk about what I want to talk about. Let's go with 1 Timothy chapter 3. I put 2 Timothy. Again, most scholars, New Testament scholars, would say, not by Paul, but how do they know? Chapter 3, I say verse 1. Yeah, okay. So he starts out with the office of bishop, and he even says that, the office of bishop, okay? Whoever aspires to the office of bishop desires a noble task. So it's a good thing to serve your community in this function. And so an overseer must be irreproachable, okay, blameless, basically the same thing, married only once, temperate, self-controlled, hospitable, a good teacher, not a drunk. So we're seeing some of the same ideas, same qualities, arise here as well. I mean, I've said this twice now, and maybe some of your ears have perked up about this, but notice that the bishops and presumably the elders and the deacons can be married, right? But they should only be married once, according to Paul. And that's ambiguous. It's not sure. Does he mean that, they could have only been married once and now the wife is dead and now they can be bishops? So they're not married then, but they were married once. Or does he mean that the bishop should be married, but only to one woman one time? If she dies, he doesn't remarry then. So it's ambiguous we don't know exactly what Paul means, but certainly the bishops can be married, and that's fine. That's always been the tradition of Christianity, that religious leaders could be married men. That's never been not the tradition. It's only later on that celibacy, which means being unmarried, celibacy does not mean not having sex. People always think that, if they want to say, no, I'm not having sex, I'm celibate. No, you're not celibate unless you're unmarried. What you mean is that you're continent. Different word. Continent means even a married person can be avoiding sex for a certain period of time. So they're continent. The husband and wife are continent. But celibacy means you're unmarried. And anyone who knows the history of the church, that don't mean you're not having sex, Mr. Wall. Oh, yes, sir. So in Western Christianity, what happened? I mean, they had married priests for the first 1,000 years, not married bishops, though, for the first 1,000 years. And that was really in the Middle Ages, in the 1000s, the 11th century, that the church kind of clamped down on the practice and said, no, anyone being admitted to holy orders, whether deacon or priest, must be a single man and must remain single throughout the rest of your life. And there were reasons for that. There were theological, spiritual reasons that the person should be only totally committed to the service of God and to the church. And that's difficult to do when you have a wife and kids. Ask any Protestant minister. I know that firsthand because I lived for many years in a Protestant seminary when I was doing my PhD. They admitted, it was just the residence hall. I wasn't studying to be a minister. Not at that time. Presbyterians, always seems to be Presbyterians I end up with. Nice people. But yeah, I mean, it can be a stressful situation because, you're the minister, you've got, a person in your church who's sick and in the hospital and wants to have the minister come by, but it's your daughter's birthday or something, or you promise to take your wife out that day or your kids. It's like, maybe later, sorry, yeah, it's difficult. It can be difficult. So the church recognized that. And also for, the popes were never really on board with married priests for centuries. The popes were always kind of trying to tell the bishops, stop ordaining married men, don't let them get married. But the bishops were doing it anyways, and the priests were doing it anyways. So they really clamped down in the 11th century and said, no more. There were also issues of property and stuff like that, because if the priest had, a family, a wife and children, and the priest dies, well, who owns the parish? Who owns the church property then? Could the kids sue and say, no, we're going to take the church, from you because it's ours, because our father was the pastor. So it made all sorts of economic and social problems as well. So, and the Eastern Church, they kind of cleared that up very quickly. They said, you don't have to be married if you want to be a priest or a deacon. You can be married, but after you're ordained to holy orders, you don't get married. You're not permitted to marry. But yes, if you're a married man, you could certainly be ordained a priest or a deacon. That's fine. But not a bishop. They did draw the line at bishop. Bishops must be celibate, unmarried, even in the Eastern churches. Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, whatever. That's always been a tradition. And again, I think it's for some of the same reasons that the bishop is supposed to be like the father for all in the diocese. He represents Christ. He represents Jesus. And so there's a spiritual reason there. He should be the spiritual father for all. However, as we see from Paul, in the earliest days, even bishops and overseers were married. And also we know from the history of the church, for the first few centuries of the church, bishops were married as well. Some of the popes were married. We know that. Because at least in the case of one pope, I think it's Pope Hormisdas. Or was it Pope Hormisdas? But in the case of one of the popes, one of his sons became pope later on. So it's not a hard, it's a rule. It's not a doctrine. It can change. It's a custom. It can change. And so you see, in some of the Protestant denominations like Episcopalianism, they have married bishops and stuff like that. Nothing wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Doesn't make a person not a bishop. But anyways, I'm not saying they are bishops because they're Protestants, so they don't have the sacraments. But I'm just making it as an example. Anyways, chapter 3. So the bishop, what do I want to say about that? Yes, we see in Timothy, 1 Timothy, that overseer and presbyter do seem to be more clearly distinguished. Okay? The office of bishop in verse 1, where does he mention the presbyter? The presbyter is mentioned in chapter 5, right? Yes, chapter 5, verse 17. Presbyters who preside well deserve double honor. Okay? So there seems to be a distinction. I say seems because he could still be using it in that ambiguous way of presbyter bishop, like they're one and the same thing. But he seems to be talking about, he could be talking about a different office. But he also mentions deacons in this letter. Deacons in chapter 3. Where did he say deacons? Yes, deacons must be dignified. So they must be worthy men or women, not deceitful, not addicted to drink, again with the drink, not greedy, not holding fast to the mystery of faith with a clear conscience. So they should be true believers, holding fast, strong, solidly to the mystery of our faith. But notice in verse 11, he mentions women. Women, similarly, should be dignified, as, also worthy, not slanderers. Which, yes, it's kind of chauvinistic. It's a kind of a chauvinistic view, but why can't male deacons not be slanderers as well? What are women talkers? As opposed to men, I don't know, but, you do see those thumbs going on the phones, right? And it's not in the same way as you see men. Maybe it's a chauvinistic comment. I apologize if you think it is. But usually you don't see, it's usually a group of girls standing around in a circle. And they're all talking to each other. They're all talking to each other in their texts, right? They're all and they're like there in a circle, right, Miss Cohen? And it's like, what's wrong with you people? Lift your head up and talk to her. I am. OMG. Hello. But slanderers, so don't talk bad about people. Be temperate and faithful in everything. Okay. Again, deacons should be married only once. All right. So this is interesting because here we have the introduction of females, deacons, into the hierarchy, apparently. Not as overseers or presbyters. Paul doesn't allow that. But he does have this order of female deacons. And what is that all about? Is that part of the hierarchy? I mean, that is a question. Because we do know historically that the office of a deaconess, a female deacon, did extend for several centuries. But it does seem to be somewhat different from the male deacon. I mean, they were both ordained to their office, so there are similarities in the ordination ceremony. But there are differences, which seem to indicate that the men were being ordained to a more permanent office than the women. Basically, deaconesses were only really necessary to assist women in the church. And mainly at baptism is what deacons were administering. Because in the early church, baptism was administered in the nude, at least for the person to be baptized. Which must have been a lot of fun. And a cold day. Right, Mr. Scott. Anyway, because it was symbolic of you're entering into the tomb with Jesus. Jesus went into the tomb in death. He came out risen in life. He would go down into the pool of water, the tube of baptismal font, and come out raised in life through baptism. So, you were naked because you were, dead people were buried in the nude. They weren't dressed up. They were buried in the nude. So there was symbolism going on there of death. There's also symbolism going on of birth because you're born naked. And baptism was also seen not just as a kind of re-death, but a rebirth as well. You're being born again in Christ. So, and the rhyme, I'm not trying to rhyme, it just happens. So the baptismal font is not just a symbol of the tomb of Jesus, who goes into the tomb and comes out risen, but also the womb, where you go in and are born again, okay? So you have all that kind of symbolism going on. And during the baptismal ceremony, so people, men and women, were nude. There are all sorts of anointings with oil, which meant that the bishop or the priest had to touch the body of the nude person, which was okay in the case of men with men. People didn't have a problem with that. But men touching women and putting oil all over their body was a little bit distracting. So the deaconesses would help, the female deacons would help. For decorum's sake, the sake of pride. So that was mainly their role. And once the church stopped doing that, people were clothed for baptism and not. They weren't the nude anymore. There really wasn't much of an issue to have deaconesses. They kind of died out as an office. But whether they were actually a real office or a permanent office in the church, like male diaconate, that's another question. Seems to be no, but nevertheless, they are similar in a lot of ways. Because the deacon could do a lot more things than the deacon issue, mainly to help the women go in places where men couldn't go. But also for charity's sake, if you're bringing charitable goods to a woman's house, a male deacon really shouldn't enter her house alone. Okay? So you send the deaconess, the woman. All righty. I guess I'll mention that because I forgot to mention it the last time I taught this class, and then I regretted it. This Greek phrase that I put on there, meta epitheseos, ton heron to presbyteriou. Okay, basically if you're reading some Bible translations like the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, it says the council of presbyters, but that's a mistranslation. I know I have it on here. But if you read whatchamacallit, here in the NABRE, they translate it as, do not neglect, this is to Paul to Timothy, do not neglect the gift that you have, which was conferred on you through the prophetic word, through the imposition of the hands of the presbyterate, or the hands of the presbyters. Okay, that's basically what it's saying. Imposition, epithesios. Why I put it even in Greek? What am I doing? Showing off? Anyways, chiron, like a chiropractor. Chiropractor, chiro, one who works with his hands, chiropractor. So it comes from Greek. Chiro means hand. Okay, so chiron, with the hands of the hand, the laying on of the hands, probably on Timothy's head, I would imagine. It says presbyterate here, the eldership, but to presbyteriou could just mean of the presbyter, of the elder, or of the elders. Okay, so, the other elders ordained you as an elder or overseer. Okay, so that's how this authority was considered to have been passed on, through the laying on of hands, a physical sign. Okay, it wasn't enough to say, okay, Timothy, you're a presbyter bishop now. No, there had to be a physical sign to indicate it, and who would like to read this quotation from a man named St. Ignatius of Antioch? Oh, sorry. The Didache. Got ahead of myself. Read from the Didache. Go ahead, sir.
Point for yourselves, bishop and deacon, worthy from the Lord, meekness, not lovers, money and fruits, and approved. Read one part alone.
Yeah, go ahead.
For they also minister to you the ministry of the prophets and teachers. Therefore, do not despise them, for they are your honorable men, together with the prophets and teachers.
Excellent. This thing called the Didache. Now we know what Didache means, right? What does Didache mean, Ms. Abdul Malak? What is Didache? Didache in Greek. What is it? Don't know? Okay. Who knows? Who remembers? They devoted them, they were unwavering towards 4 things, right? Didache, koinonia, Eucharistia, the Lord's Supper, and the prayer. Go ahead.
Teaching.
God bless you. Thank you. Teaching. Didache. Okay? In English, the teaching of the 12 apostles is the name of this work. The teaching of the 12 apostles. Of the 12 apostles. Very important work. Very early work. Scholars date it to around the 90s AD. So it's New Testament times. Written around the time of the Gospel of John, Book of Revelation, 2 Peter. Okay, it might even be before some of the New Testament books. But it's quite early. We don't know who wrote it, but it claims to be a record of the teaching that has been handed on from the apostles of Jesus. Okay, it's called the Didache in Greek, and in English it's called the Didache. We didn't know about it. I mean, we kind of knew it existed for 2,000 years, but it was only actually discovered, or rediscovered, I should say, in the 1800s. It's actually copied and embedded in another longer work. And someone realized, wait a second, this is a separate work, and then found a man. Actually, I think they did find a distinct manuscript. But regardless, it's still a very early work, and it shows a very early picture of the church, Christian church. It's very early. It opens with some very early quotations, which might be from the Gospels or sayings of Jesus, kind of like what we find in the Gospels. They're a little bit different. It's very ancient. And it talks about the authority structure. And already we can see an authority structure. This authority structure.
basically the same thing I've been describing. Presbyter bishops, just as bishops, and servants or deacons. And then you should appoint them. And what does that mean? Does that mean like the community they're the ones who are appointing them? Yeah, it could be. Some scholars want to interpret it that way. That way you don't need bishops to appoint them. But, you do need the overseers for something. I mean, they're supposed to appoint people. So who's appointing them? Probably you're just selecting, in the sense of selecting the men that you want to be your bishops and your deacons, so that then they can be ordained, have hands laid on them by the other presbyter bishops or elders. Okay? And again, they should be worthy men, meek, gentle, not lovers of money. Okay? Nothing about being drunks this time. Good for me. Truthful, approved by somebody. Okay? Because they serve you. They serve you in the ministry of the prophets and teachers. Okay, so they have a spiritual role. They're like the prophets. They announce the will of God in the community. They're also teachers. They explain the will of God. And that's a big deal. That's the main, when we looked at Titus, I forgot to talk about this, but if you read further in the letter of Titus, I mean, that's a big deal for Paul, that Titus, one of his main things is that he needs to proclaim the true doctrine and to correct those who are spreading, in Paul's mind, false doctrine. So that's where I get the orthodoxy and heresy. All right, so I'll come back to this. I knew there was a reason for it. The difference between orthodoxy and heresy. Correct teaching, orthos. Like you go to an orthodontist and he fixes your teeth. He sets them right. Orthos. Dont becomes the Greek word odons, which means tooth. Doxia can mean glory, but it also means teaching. So right teaching is literally what orthodoxy means. So holding the correct teaching or belief. And then heresy is holding a teaching or belief that's considered to be false, that's not correct. So it's the opposite of orthodoxy. And hiereo in Greek means to seize or to choose. Basically, it can also mean like a faction, like a party, like a political party. Hierasis, heresy in Greek could mean, just a faction or a sect that splits off from the larger group. They go their own way. They seize, they choose what they want to believe rather than believing what everyone else believes. So they break themselves off, hierasis. They're a sect or a broken off piece. So the heretics are those who have broken off from the orthodox belief system. They're their own little group, believing what they want to believe. Which, of course, from the orthodox perspective, is wrong. And we must kill them. Well, no, we mustn't, but eventually we will. Oh, yay. Good. Off she goes. But you're back, Mr. Root. I don't know, Mr. Root. Mr. Scott brought in that jug of water, right? You still have that jug of water? Maybe we can find some other uses for that. Sorry, I'm a bad man. Okay, who would like to... Oh, Lumen Gentium. Let's pass over Lumen Gentium. I want to get to this. Let's get to this man, St. Ignatius of Antioch. Who would like to read this quote from him? This man Ignatius of Antioch. Mr. Cruz. No? No? Okay, that's fine. That's your... Hey. You still participated. You want to do it? Yeah, go ahead.
See, you all follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christ is the Father, and follow the priests as you would the apostles, and reverence the deacons as being constant.
That's all right.
Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is done either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude also be. Even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast. But whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. It is well to reverence both God and the bishop. He who honors the bishop has been honored by God.
Excellent, sir. Okay, so let's quote from a letter to the Smyrnians. To the Smyrnians. The Smyrnians. Now, this guy, St. Ignatius of Antioch, he lived from around 50 AD, and died in 117 AD. And he left us a series of letters. He was a Christian believer, and he was arrested for being a Christian, and he was going to be executed because he would not worship the gods of, well, the pagan gods of the nation, which was kind of a crime. You're offending the gods. Sacrilege, I guess. So they were sending him all the way to Rome for his execution. So they put him on a boat, and as he's from Syria, he's from here, he was a Syrian man, and a Syrian gentleman, listener. And so they were sending him all the way over here to the city of Rome for his execution. So we knew he was going to die. I mean, that was a certainty, basically. And along the way, he decides to write letters to communities of Christians who are living in various places. Turkey, Greece, to the Romans, when he gets near Rome. Okay? And they're not very long letters, basically telling them, his faith. He knows he's going to die, asks for their prayers, and basically wants them to be strong in their faith. Okay, so Smyrna, I think this is Smyrna. Yeah, I think this is where Smyrna was, city of Smyrna. Okay, there's a Christian community there. So, he wrote a bunch of letters. Not all the letters that claim to be from Ignatius are by him. What we're doing, we're reading from one of his authentic letters, or scholars think is one of his authentic letters. So you have to be careful if you go on the internet, because not some of them are pseudo-Ignatius, but this is authentically Ignatius, apparently. So again, New Testament times. He's even living during the time of some of the, there she is, some of the apostles, Paul, remember, Paul dies maybe in the 60s. St. Peter, Simon Peter is killed in the mid-60s. Ignatius was probably a young kid back then, or a young man, but nevertheless, he was contemporaneous with some of the apostles of Jesus of Nazareth. And he's a Christian. So one thread through all of his letters is follow the bishop. He's very big on the position of the overseer. Follow the bishop. When you follow the bishop, you're following God, basically. Yeah, it's a good summary of his whole message. And, look at what he says about the bishop. The overseer is the source of doctrinal and spiritual unity. Okay, he's part of the teaching, the one who teaches, okay, he's the one who's been committed with the teaching of the gospel, and he's the one who passes it on and interprets it authentically. And this is from the will of God. And we saw this, again, the same kind of argument in the letter of the Romans to the Corinthians, yes, that might have been written by Pope St. Clement, one of the popes of Rome at the time, or several. The bishop, follow the bishop as Jesus Christ does the Father. So just as Jesus follows the God, you follow the bishop. Oh, that's interesting. So the bishop doesn't even stand in the place of Jesus. He stands in the place of God. And I'm like Jesus in following the bishop. That's the metaphor. Follow the elders, the priests, as the apostles. So he uses this metaphor of the apostles represent the elders. And the deacons, I don't know. That's why I have a question mark. I have no idea what he means here. The deacons are the institution of God. Okay, I guess he ran out of metaphors there. Because, I mean, if I were going to follow his metaphor logically, you know, if you're honoring the bishop, you're honoring God, I would say the bishop is God, priests are Jesus, and then the deacons are the apostles. But he doesn't follow that metaphor. But that seemed to make more sense. But then again, you know, Mr. Wilmer, he's on his way to die. He's he's an older guy. You know he's going to get his head chopped off. I'll cut him some slack. He has other things on his mind. You know what I'm saying? Then, what a literary critic like me is going to say. But this is interesting. Look, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the breaking of the bread should not be held without the bishop. Okay? The Eucharist has been entrusted to the authority and care of the bishop. He rules over it. Okay? And it's a sign of communion with the bishop, in a way. It's a sign of your communion as a Christian. Okay? If you believe in Jesus Christ, you can't celebrate that. You have to believe correctly. And the bishop is the touchstone of correct belief. And if you don't believe correctly, then you can't celebrate the Eucharist, at least not with him. Because where the bishop is, there the church should be, the multitude, the assembly. So the assembly unites around the bishop, just as the church assembles around Jesus. Just as where Jesus is, there is the Catholic Church. Now, the statement Catholic Church, it's not a title. He's not using it in the specific sense of like the Roman Catholic Church. He's using it because Catholic in Greek, katholikos, simply means universal. Okay? So he's probably not using like a name, the trademark for the Catholic Church, okay? But there is a reason why the Catholic Church is called the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church really doesn't have an official name. It's a traditional name. I mean, you never see TM after the name Catholic Church, do you? I mean, the Catholic Church hasn't gone to the government and tried to trademark it, saying no one else can be called the Catholic Church. It's a tradition. It's a custom, okay? It's like... even Orthodox churches, the Eastern Orthodox, call themselves the Catholic Church. They represent the Holy Orthodox and Catholic faith. So they combine orthodoxy with universality. It's right belief, but it also includes everyone in the world should hopefully be Christian. So he's talking about the universal church, is a better translation than this older translation. But I don't want you to get the impression that it's specifically talking about the Church of Rome. It's talking about all the Christians throughout all the world at that time, the universe, which for Ignatius meant the Roman Empire. Okay, yes, there are obviously there's a whole bunch of the earth that they didn't know about. But for him, the Roman Empire was the universe, cosmos. So this is the universal church spread throughout the empire. It's in Turkey, it's in Greece, it's even in Rome, the center of the empire. So just as the church congregates around Jesus Christ, the assembly, the local assembly of the church, congregates around the overseer. You can't even baptize without the permission of the overseer. So here we have a very full-blown theology or understanding, very high view of the overseer. The overseer or the bishop is the highest in the hierarchy. And then where do the priests and deacons fit in? Whoops. Actually, where does the Pope fit in? Well, maybe I'll get to the Pope. We'll see. The bishop has the fullness of authority. And then as it comes to be understood, that authority is delegated to the elders. The elders can do some things the bishop can do. And then the deacons are kind of different. The deacons are really servants or helpers of the bishop. So they're of a different level. The priests are related to, how would I put this? Well, anyways, the bishop is like Jesus, the high priest. Jesus offers himself on the cross. He serves others, okay? But he also delegates some of his authority to his apostles. He says they can raise the dead, they can cast out demons, but it's all based on Jesus' authority. So a bishop has the fullness of authority in the church in his area that he presides over. But he has priests who are like his co-workers, and so he delegates his authority just as Jesus did. A priest needs, for example, the permission of the bishop to celebrate the Lord's Supper. He can't just do it on his own. It would still be valid if he did it. It would still be the body and blood of Christ through the power of the priesthood, but it would be illicit. It would be illegal in a manner of speaking. You need priests. They get a document from the bishop saying, you have my permission to celebrate the Eucharist. You need the permission to preach in the bishop's diocese. Bishop can take that away from an elder and say, no, you can't preach. To hear confessions, to witness marriages. Okay? A priest cannot function in a diocese on his own without the permission of the bishop because he's the co-worker. As I said, deacons are different. They're servants. They are not ordained to the priestly aspect of Jesus' ministry of offering the Lord's Supper or of forgiving sins, okay? But they are members of the hierarchy, but they're seen more as in the service of charity. They assist the bishop in his mission of proclaiming the gospel and performing the sacraments, which we'll talk about later. Okay, where does the Pope fit into all of this? I probably should mention it. Not going to mention it today, though. Save it for next week. Now, I'll have the weekend to ruminate over whether I want to mention the Pope. I probably should because it's a major issue, but I do want to get on to God. God's kind of a big issue too, right, Ms. Wamelsdorf? Anyways, so God bless you all. Have a good weekend. Very briefly, Ms. Wamelsdorf will probably say something. I'll probably say something about the Pope very briefly.